Good evening. How are we doing? Life is good? Yeah? Doing okay? Doing okay. Well, we've got a good evening ahead of us here. So welcome to the 61st Honors Colloquium, Democracy in Peril this fall. And we are looking forward to quite an exciting topic tonight from Naomi Oreskes. I want to start with a few housekeeping details before we go any further. The exits are in the back on the side here, should you need those. The bathrooms are out in front. And we would ask you please to not take photos or record videos tonight. I have a couple of QR codes for you, but after I show you those, I would ask you to please silence your phones and put them away so that we can turn our full attention to our wonderful guest tonight. If you do need to leave before the event is done tonight, I would ask you please to go very quietly and be careful of the doors. They do make quite the noise when they shut. So please help us with that if you do have to leave, and refrain from speaking until you've left the building. The sound carries quite well into the room. But before we go any further, I would like to welcome Canyon Baker, a URI student and a Narragansett tribal member, to join me for the land acknowledgement and to say a few words once I have read that. Canyon. The University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities and becoming stewards of the land that we too inhabit. Canyon, please.
Oskaway Kwasanumis, Natasu East Canyon. Hello everyone, I am Canyon and I am a member of the Narragansett Indian tribe. You are currently on unceded homeland of the Narragansett. Only 100 years ago, in 1924, did indigenous peoples gain the right to vote, over 300 years since the arrival of the English. Only 100 years ago, in the span of over 400 years, we were given the right to be heard, and even now we are not always listened to. Right now, I am using my voice, a voice that I should never have to earn, to speak for my ancestors, who were told that their voices had no value. I am using this voice to remind you that we are still here and we deserve to be heard, no less than anyone else on these lands. Thank you for listening.
Now, as Associate Director of the Honors Program, I would like to tell you about us a little bit. The mission of our colloquium is to foster campus-wide and community-wide discussion on pressing issues of our time. So with that, there are a few events I want to point out. First of all, if you care to go across the quad to Lippett Hall, we have sustaining, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We should note the Humanities Lecture Series, which on November 13th will have Salvation and Scandal at Michigan's House of David, where Evelyn Stern, a history professor, will tell us about the most long-enduring religious community set up in the country. I would also like to tell you about the fact that we collaborated with the URI Theater, which has now ended its run, sadly. I hope some of you saw Machinal, a powerful play about the subjugation of women in capitalist industrial society. If you missed the theater, you can see the paintings. You can come and see the art showcase at Lippett Hall. You can go across the quad. The building is open there until late, and you can see 70-something artworks, some of them absolutely stunning, all of them magnificent. And up on the 4th floor, if you go there, you'll see a 12-foot Castro, which is not something you see often. So I would recommend taking a look. Or maybe not something you want to see, but he's there. The Hera Gallery has a show right now, which is still open for a couple of weeks, called Democracy Under Siege. And some of you, see repeat faces in here, have gotten postcards where you have filled out describing democracy in 10 words or less, and they have blanketed some of their walls with those postcards. So if for nothing else, might be worth going to take a look. Now, I would also like to tell you about the fact that we are collaborating with Rise Up, the Resilient, Innovative, Sustainable Economies via University Partnership, which is a 401 TechBridge endeavor here, where we are encouraging students to take part in working toward a more democratic society through innovative and entrepreneurship means. And I would heavily recommend any students in this room to now grab your phone and get a shot of this QR code, or to get information on the table outside after tonight's event. There are cash prizes, and it is really quite a rewarding competition to take part in. Finally, I would ask all of you to grab this QR code and see if you might support the honors program by a small donation or a large donation if you're feeling good about it. We support all sorts of student activities, travel, classroom technology, and other things with these donations, and we need all the help we can get. So thank you for doing that. Now, I would ask you to give a special thanks to the organizers of this event. To organize a colloquium like this is no small feat. It takes a couple of years. And I would like to read out the names of the colloquium coordinators: Mark Hutchison, Ashley Rundlet, Brian Kruger, Beth Mendenhall, and Richard McIntyre, all from the College of Arts and Sciences. Let's have a little round of applause for them. I would also like to thank the sponsors this year who are listed on the program. And I would very much like to express my thanks to the president of the university and his office, and to the provost of the university and her office, both of whom are sustaining sponsors for our colloquium. So another round of applause for our supporters. Now, for next week, however, before I totally let go of the microphone, I would ask you to join us for the talk, our final one in this series, by Christian Davenport, on repression and the decline of global human rights. Christian Davenport is professor for the study of human understanding and a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, and a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. So I think we can expect something pretty interesting from there. Now, to introduce our speaker, please welcome Ashley Rundlet, one of the organizers of the colloquium and a professor of political science. Thank you.
Good evening. One quick note, the talk is not going to be next week. To steal this from one of my colleagues, next Tuesday there is a small minor event in civic participation that is occurring that is going to prevent us from having one of these wonderful talks, so it will be taking place in 2 weeks. We all have. All right. So welcome back to our Democracy in Peril series. I am Ashley Rundlet, a colloquium coordinator and an assistant professor in the political science department. As we move through our series on the challenges of democracy, this week's speaker, Dr. Naomi Oreskes, will examine disinformation, a key factor eroding democratic trust and transparency. Her talk connects with insights that we've heard about the politicization of institutions like the military and the judiciary, and it builds on discussions about how various forces, whether ideological, institutional, or social, can undermine democratic processes. Using diverse examples from corporate profit motives to public health crises, she examines how elites often purposefully use disinformation to undermine trust and to distort public understanding. As we've learned in past talks, democracies are radically different from other forms of government in that they allow ordinary citizens to choose the political candidates and policies that affect their collective lives. Without sound information to draw upon, the core foundation of democracy, that people are the best judges of their own interests, is undermined. As such, this talk will help us understand how disinformation is produced, and why disinformation threatens the integrity of democratic decision-making. Dr. Naomi Oreskes is Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and affiliated professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. She is known for her pioneering work on the history of scientific knowledge and the influence of corporate and political interests on public understanding. Her groundbreaking and best-selling book, Merchants of Doubt, exposed the tactics used by industries to sow confusion around established sciences, from climate change to public health, and it was later adapted into an award-winning film. Her most recent book, The Big Myth, delves into how corporate propaganda has shaped American ideas about free market and individual responsibility. After a brief talk from Dr. Oreskes, we will welcome my colleague, Dr. Rick McIntyre, a professor in the economics department, to continue the conversation. But for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. So thank you for coming, and we'll get started. Oops. Okay. So I was asked specifically to talk tonight about the problem of disinformation, and even more specifically about why disinformation matters. And in some ways, on some level, this feels to me a bit like analyzing the obvious. I think everyone here knows that climate change is not a hoax. I think we all know that in the long run, denial makes things worse, not better. I think we know that the solution to disinformation is not to give equal time to both sides. And I think we know that more often than not, truth does not lie in the middle. But still, there are people who are skeptical. There are people who argue that studying disinformation is a distraction, that it's not the main event, and that focusing on disinformation is polarizing. I've been accused of demonizing the fossil fuel industry, to which I respond, they kind of do that themselves. The point I want to make tonight, though, is that disinformation is not a distraction. It's not a sideline. It's not making a mountain out of a molehill to study it, because disinformation hurts people. It hurts people in many different ways, and ultimately, it undermines democracy. And that's what I want to talk about then tonight, is 3 domains in which we have clear evidence of the ways in which disinformation hurts. So I want to talk first about health, then about climate change, and then about democracy. So an obvious example where disinformation has hurt people, where disinformation has killed people, is tobacco. For decades, as we all now know, thanks to work of historians such as Robert Proctor and Alan Brandt, but also thanks to the work of lawyers, including the US Department of Justice, people like Sharon Eubanks, we know that for decades, the tobacco industry bombarded the American people with disinformation and misleading marketing about tobacco products. They claimed that we didn't really know if smoking caused cancer, when in fact we did, we being the scientists who studied it. This is an advertisement that ran in major newspapers around the country, a frank statement to cigarette smokers, sponsored by the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, that claimed that the science was still unsettled about the causes of cancer, long after scientists at places like Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute had shown that tobacco caused cancer. They made us think that smoking was glamorous when in fact it caused cancer, emphysema, heart disease, blindness, and they paid for product placement in movies and television, paid for actresses like Audrey Hepburn to smoke cigarettes in movies to make it seem glamorous. And they even claimed that Lucky's made you healthy. The reality is that tobacco killed huge numbers of people. The World Health Organization has calculated or estimated that the use of tobacco products in the 20th century killed 100 million people. Now, if you remember your high school history, you may know that that is more than all the deaths in World War II, including the Holocaust, and including civilian casualties, including things like people who starved in the siege of Leningrad. Virtually every town in America has a memorial to the men and women who died in World War II, but where are the tobacco memorials? Where are the reminders of the people who died because of what this industry did? Servicemen and women know why they gave their lives, but do smokers know? Do we? So what difference did this disinformation make? One of the challenges of doing any kind of historical work is often you can show what happened. You can't always prove what the impact of that was. But I think in this case, we can say a few things. So one of the questions that sometimes people pose to me, okay, well, if these people had known that smoking caused cancer and other deadly diseases, if we hadn't had disinformation from the tobacco industry, would these people have all quit? And I think the answer is obviously, well, no, they wouldn't all have quit. In fact, maybe many of them would have kept on smoking. But we know for sure that at least some of them would have quit, or at least I should say, we know that's what the industry thought. We know from their own reports, their own documents, their own memos, that the reason they launched these disinformation campaigns, the reason they made a conscious decision to hide the truth, to fight the facts, and to promote the falsehood that the science was unsettled, was to keep people smoking and profits flowing, because they believed that if people knew the truth about their product, if people knew how dangerous it was, that people would be motivated to quit, and many of them would quit. Now, smoking is our clearest example of the harms of disinformation, but we have many other areas of health harm from disinformation. So we all have now just lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all have witnessed many of the things that happened. But I don't know if we all really appreciate how many people died in this country because of mask refusal, because of vaccine refusal. And here's an interesting one that I've only been learning about recently myself: the deaths due to obesity as a source of comorbidity. So let's talk a bit about that. So those of us who wore our masks did it because we accepted the scientific recommendation that wearing masks could slow the spread of COVID-19. But this question was actually proven in what you could call a sort of natural experiment in the state of Kansas. So early in the pandemic, the governor of Kansas issued an executive order requiring masking in all public places. She immediately experienced very strong political pushback, partly on political grounds, people claiming it was a question of personal choice or freedom whether they did or did not mask, and partly based on disinformation, claims that masking didn't work. So she backed off, and she came to a compromise with the legislature that individual counties could decide for themselves. So from a scientific standpoint, this was fantastic because it meant we had data on counties that were otherwise very similar in the same state, similar populations, not exactly the same, but similar, some who masked and some who didn't. And afterwards, a group of researchers at the University of Kansas looked closely at the death rates, the case rates, in order to see what difference masking made, if any. So what they showed, and this was recently published, when the mask mandates were implemented, cases went down, hospitalization went down, and deaths all went down in the counties that enforced the mask mandate. But in all of the other counties, every single one, cases, hospitalizations, and deaths went up. Now, these are typical scientific figures that are hard to read. So here's a simpler one that MSNBC put together. So red are the counties that had no masking. Blue are the counties that said yes to masking. July 3rd is when the governor issued the mask mandate. Give it about 2 weeks for the effect to kick in. And here you see an interesting thing. So right at the start of the period of the mandate, the red counties actually had lower COVID rates than the ones that are shown here in blue. But pretty much as soon as the mask mandate, so these counties all saw, well, all of the counties were seeing increasing rates, but these in particular were seeing a big increase. As soon as the mask mandate is enforced, you see the cases pretty much level out. So in the counties that enforced mask mandates, COVID levels flattened. But in the counties that did not enforce mandates, the cases continued to rise. They actually crossed, there's a crossover point here, and then they keep going up and up through the period where it's being studied. But during this time, mask deniers, that's not really the best term for it, but mask resistors, we could call them, continued to insist that masks didn't work, and there are many people, even today on social media and elsewhere, who will tell you that masks didn't work, when in fact we know that they did. What about vaccine refusal? There's been a lot of press about that. What do we know about what actually happened there? Well, we know that overall, once vaccines became widely available in the United States, the death rates began to decline, but we also know that they didn't stop entirely, and there are various reasons for that. This isn't the only reason, but a significant reason is that many people continued to get sick and die. So who were the people who were still dying after vaccination became widely available? Well, one of the things we know is that it was mostly unvaccinated people. So this chart from the World in Data begins in October 2021. So this is, sorry, I don't know why this isn't working. Oh, well, it doesn't really matter. October 2021, so that's a few months after vaccines begin to become widely available. We see, very high case rates. But then, as more and more people become vaccinated, case rates go down, both among the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. But as we move into 2022, we see, a year after the vaccines become available, we see that cases actually begin to climb again among unvaccinated people, and they stay fairly high into 2023, whereas among vaccinated people, the case rates are much lower. So how many people died after vaccines were widely available? Well, you can do the area under the curve. Peter Hotez, who's written a book about this, he estimates that 500,000 Americans died in what were essentially preventable deaths. That number might be too high. I've been looking at other people's estimates. Some people say it's only 200 or only 300,000. It's still a lot of people who died because of vaccine refusal. And then there's this interesting complication that has to do with obesity. So early in the pandemic, a group of scientists based in Germany noticed a link between obesity and severe COVID-19. They noticed, and we know, of course, that obesity is related to a whole set of comorbidities, but they also showed that it also led to higher rates of severe COVID-19, and severe COVID-19 was more likely to result in deaths. And so they began to argue that hospitals needed to be paying attention to who among their patients was severely overweight and perhaps treat them more aggressively than they might otherwise do. But most hospitals, particularly here in the United States, were not measuring or reporting body mass index or glucose levels in patients. So why not? Well, this is a complicated and somewhat sensitive subject, and it's not entirely clear exactly what happened. But one thing we do know is that here in the United States, the use of the metric of body mass index has been severely criticized, and possibly rightly so. I'm not saying that we need to bring back BMI as an important source of information. I think the criticisms of BMI are pretty valid, but one of the reasons it's been criticized is because it's a source of stigma, because overweight people are stigmatized, and so if a person is labeled obese because of their body mass index, it affects how doctors treat them, and there's good evidence to show that this is true. So this is a real problem, but in response to that real problem, many doctors decided or felt that they really shouldn't use BMI, and more important, that they really shouldn't scrutinize the role of weight in health because it could be stigmatizing. So that was not necessarily a wrong conclusion, but it did lead to probably, arguably, more overweight people dying from COVID-19 because doctors were reluctant to talk about the role of obesity. So let's look at that a little bit more closely and ask the question, well, why are so many Americans overweight? And of course, one of the reasons this is associated with stigma is this sense that overweight people are blamed, that it's their fault, that there's a persistent negative stereotype associated with claiming that overweight people are lazy or undisciplined. But I want to argue that overweight people aren't overweight because they're lazy or undisciplined, but because of the food we eat. So we know that Americans are much heavier than citizens of other comparable wealthy nations like Germany or France. And we also know that Americans have become much heavier in the past several decades. So this is a chart from USA Facts, and it shows the dramatic increase in obesity in America. So if you go back to the early 1960s, about 13% of Americans were obese. Today, it's over 40%. It's about 43%. So nearly half of us are obese. So what changed? Well, obviously our genes can't have changed that much in only 1 or 2 generations. Fruit flies can evolve that quickly, but humans don't. But we know that one thing that has changed is our diet. Since 1970, the average American calorie intake has increased 25% from about 2,000 calories, which most nutritionists would say is a reasonable amount for an ordinary average man, to over 2,500 calories, which is enough to make anyone put on weight. Why have our calorie intakes increased so much? Well, more dairy, particularly as cheese, which is often high fat, more fats and oils, big increases in added fats in our food, more fast food, which tends to be high in fat, sugar, and salt, and more processed and ultra-processed foods, including the so-called hyper-palatable food. Now, some of you, if you're as old as I am, you may remember this ad, the Lay's potato ad, where the devil says, "I bet you just can't eat just one." Well, the devil was right. We couldn't eat just one because these potato chips were manufactured to be hyper-palatable. They actually did studies where they adjusted the amount of salt, sugar, and fat in the potato chips to figure out what recipe would make these potato chips so palatable that we would find it hard to eat, not even just one, but just 5 or just 10. So you can think about who the true devil is in this story. So while all this was going on, while our diet was changing, while foods were being manufactured to be hyper-palatable, we were also bombarded with misleading advertising. Advertising and marketing that implied these foods were good for us, or at least that they were part of a balanced diet. And just for fun, I asked ChatGPT last night as I was finishing my talk, can Lucky Charms be part of a healthy diet? And guess what ChatGPT said? Yes, Lucky Charms can be part of a balanced diet because they contain whole grains and are a source of nutrients. So, we know that during the pandemic, American death rates were far higher than in most of the rest of the world, even many poorer countries. But even before the pandemic, death rates in the United States were higher. US life expectancy was notably lower than other comparable. So here's the average. This is again from the World in Data. Comparable country average, that's mostly OECD countries. And you can see the United States substantially lower. Here we have a 6-year difference. Even before the pandemic, and then it gets even worse. So the American diet's not the only reason we live shorter lives. There are other factors that certainly contribute, but it is certainly one of the reasons. And I think it's pretty fair to say that it contributed to COVID-19 mortality. And the other thing I just wanted to point out, we're not very happy in this country. If you look at any measure of happiness, the United States typically lands not even in the top 10 or 15, so lots of places in the world, virtually all European countries, but also Costa Rica, Kuwait, Chechnya, Lithuania, Slovenia. People are happier in all these other countries, some of which are not as wealthy as the United States. So my conclusion is that happy meals do not make us happy. Now, advertising is not generally thought of as disinformation, but maybe it should be. Advertising and marketing have contributed to our eating food that we thought was healthy, or at least we thought it was healthy enough, but in fact was making us sick. So now let me talk a little bit about climate change. For the past 20 years, I've worked on the question of the causes and effects of climate change denial. I've written 3 books that deal either entirely or substantially with this issue, so it's quite hard for me to talk about it for only 5 or 10 minutes, but that's what I'm going to do tonight. And I want to just emphasize a couple of things out of this large body of work, and also acknowledge my co-author in all this work, Eric Conway. So we know that since the 1990s, Americans have been consistently much more skeptical about the scientific evidence of climate change than people in any other country in the world, including China, India, Brazil, whatever. And we know that significant portions of the US of America have held and continue to hold views that are inconsistent with the conclusions of scientific experts. And we also know that views on climate science are highly polarized, with science rejection correlating most strongly with political party or self-identified political leanings. So people have looked at income, gender, religion, race, a whole lot of different things, many of which do make some difference, but the single strongest correlation is self-identified political leanings. Now, scientists have concluded for a long time now that it's unequivocal that the planet is warming and that the cause of this warming is human activity, putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels, deforestation, certain forms of agriculture, and other land use changes. There is no scientific evidence to support the conclusion of any other primary driving force. And indeed, nowadays, most Americans do say that they believe that the climate is changing. But when Pew researchers ask the question, does human activity contribute to climate change? So not even cause, just contribute, so a softer claim. Less than half of Americans give what scientists would say is a scientifically correct answer, which in this, the options here are a great deal, some, or not too much. So the scientifically correct answer in this case would be a great deal. 79% of the American people, so it's a huge majority, attribute some or most of the climate change to natural variability. And these results, as I've already suggested, are highly polarized. 84% of self-identified liberal Democrats give the answer that's closest to being correct scientifically, but only 14% of conservative Republicans do. In fact, 87% of conservative Republicans think climate change can be explained entirely, or at least mostly, by natural variability. Now, I'm going to skip this because it's more detail than we need tonight. So why do so many people think that climate change, particularly Republicans think, that climate change can be explained by natural variability? Well, we've argued in our work is that at least part of the answer to that is because that is what we have been repeatedly told, particularly by the fossil fuel industry and particularly by conservative political and social leaders. So if you are yourself a self-identified conservative, the people you identify as leaders have been telling you for 3 decades that climate change is caused by natural variability. And I want to just show you a small clip here. Just one example. This is Lee Raymond, the longtime CEO of ExxonMobil, and this was in a television interview where he was asked whether or not he believed that his product, his company's product, caused climate change. And here's what he says.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
So there you have it, sunspots and wobbling of the earth.
There is a natural variability.
But it's not just Lee Raymond. Republican politicians have been basically saying the same thing for a long time. Back in 2007, I know people often feel these days, well, if you still watch television, which many of us don't, but if you do, you want to throw a rock at the TV. So I had that experience back in 2007, listening to an interview with then Vice President Dick Cheney, who the IPCC had just issued its 4th assessment report that said climate change was unequivocal, it was caused by human activities, and Cheney was asked about this, and he said, well, I think there's an emerging consensus that we do have global warming. Where there does not appear to be a consensus is the extent to which that's part of a normal cycle versus the extent to which it's caused by man, greenhouse gases, et cetera. And still today, you can find similar arguments being promoted in many cases. So this is a screenshot from just the other day from a website called Energy Education at the University of Calgary. Many of you may know Calgary is a big oil and gas town. So it actually took me a while to even understand what the heck they were saying here. It's a very muddled description, so I'll just bring your attention to this part. In the last 650,000 years, there have been around 7 ice ages, the most recent ending around 12,000 years ago. Since then, the Earth has experienced a glacial advance known as the Little Ice Age, which occurred from the 16th century through the 19th. However, Earth is still in the natural warming process from this glacial advance. In other words, the warming that we're experiencing now is simply the recovery from the Little Ice Age. And that's at a university, even if they are Canadian. So why does this matter? Well, I want to argue as a historian who has worked for the last 20 years with a historian of technology, that I think that to a very large extent, we could have fixed this problem by now. Well, why do I say that? Well, if we think about when scientists first started speaking out on this issue, a good place to start is 1988, when the NASA climate modeler James Hansen testified in the US Congress that he and his team at NASA were 99% certain that man-made climate change was underway. That is to say, not natural variability, but that they could discern, they could detect the human effect separate from the background natural variability. 4 years later, and that was reported on the front page of the New York Times and in many newspapers and television and radio reports across the country. 4 years later, President George H.W. Bush traveled to Rio de Janeiro, where he attended the Earth Summit and signed the international treaty known as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed its signatories to working to preventing, quote, dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And when President Bush signed that document, he called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. That's 32 years ago. So for the students in the audience, that's well before you were even born. So what could we have done in those 30 years if we hadn't succumbed to disinformation and confusion? Well, I just pulled a few examples. The interstate highway system, that took about 30 years to build. That transformed the United States. It was first, the funding was first authorized in 1944. Construction began in the 1950s under President Dwight Eisenhower, and it was declared completed in the 1970s, so about 30 years. Or how about the internet? That's another technology that has changed our lives. Well, again, about 25 to 30 years. The first schematics were developed in the 1960s. The internet was operational when I started graduate school in 1984, and in 1989, the computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee proposed the concept for what became the World Wide Web. So again, about 30 years. Here's an even better example. The University of Rhode Island, according to your website, this university only took 2 years to build. That's astonishing. You guys should really be advertising that. Or how about a nuclear power plant? People can have different views about nuclear power, but the average US nuclear power plant takes about 20 years to build. So you could do a lot of things in 30 years. You can build an interstate highway system. You can build nuclear power plants. You could build a university. And what about renewable energy? If we want to solve the climate problem, we obviously have to have a rapid build-out of renewable energy. Large offshore wind, well, I'm in Rhode Island, so you guys know something about that. Revolution Wind began construction last year in 2023, and it's expected to be fully operational in 2026, so that's 3 years. Onshore wind farms can be stood up in 1 to 3 years. You can put solar panels on your roof, typically in 1 to 6 months, and community solar farms can typically be built in 6 to 18 months. So I would argue, and of course counterfactual history is always somewhat speculative, but I would argue that in the 30 years that we failed to take action, in part because of the effects of disinformation, we could have transformed or largely transformed our energy system. And what are the costs of delay? What are the costs that accrued to the fact that we didn't do that? Well, we often talk about climate change in terms of future damage, but a great deal of damage has already occurred, and increasingly, scientists have begun to calculate that damage. So here are a few statistics from the World Health Organization and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. If we try to estimate people who have died already due to extreme weather events, the World Health Organization concludes that about 2 million people have died in extreme weather events that were made worse by climate change. If we look at the financial losses associated with these extreme weather events, something like $4 trillion. That would pay for a lot of universities. NOAA has looked at the United States, estimating the number of extreme weather events where costs exceeded $1 billion since 1980. They estimate there have been 400 such events, and that the total cost of those events is approaching $3 trillion. So you could just think for a few minutes about what we could have done with that money. And just more recently, Hurricanes Helene and Milton estimated $80 billion in insured losses. So that's just what insurance companies are going to now be asked to pay. It doesn't include the psychic trauma, the loss of heirlooms, the emotional losses associated with these kinds of traumatic events, the pets that people have lost. I mean, the uninsured losses probably match or even exceed the insured losses. And what happens if we continue delay? Well, this is from a simulation I did with my own students at Harvard. So some of you may be familiar with John Sturman at MIT's computer simulation called En-ROADS, part of a project called Climate Interactive. If you don't know about this, I highly recommend you look at it. It's really fun. You can go online. It's free. You can use it. Just go to climateinteractive.org, and you can build a model to test how different policy options help keep global mean temperature increase below that 2-degree threshold that the IPCC talks about all the time. So 2 years ago, I asked my students to run the model with no remedies, no policies, just business as usual, just to get a sense of what happens if we do nothing. And so one of the things that made all of my students sit up and take notice was this simulation of gross world products. So this is all the economic activity in the world. And if we do nothing, if we pursue business as usual, temperature is going to increase probably by 3.5 degrees C, maybe more. And by the year 2100, so here's economic growth, and you can see what happens. It flattens out. So by 2100, economic growth essentially comes to a standstill. So you're looking at not just $3 or $4 trillion, but possibly something like 400 trillion. And that's a number that's so giant that it's hard even to get your head around. Now, we don't often talk in these terms, but I think the important thing that we need to think about and talk about is that uncontrolled climate change is going to make us all a lot poorer, because we're going to be spending trillions of dollars, not just billions, but trillions, on cleaning up the damage. Money that could have been spent on roads and bridges, schools and hospitals, museums and national parks, not to mention Social Security, Medicare, social programs, or even national defense. And then that brings me to democracy. The response to COVID, the response to climate change make clear that large portions of American people have been influenced by disinformation. Disinformation that affects their personal choices, what actions they take, whether they do or don't get vaccinated, and it also affects how they vote. And it affects what they think about democracy, what they believe about democracy. We all know that in the past decade, we've seen skyrocketing amounts of disinformation, particularly on social media. And much of this disinformation has been aimed at fomenting distrust in government and government officials. And we've seen the results. And so this is the shortest part of my talk, because I think we already know this. I don't think I have to belabor it. But threats to doctors and nurses during the pandemic, the January 6th attack on Congress, death threats and attacks on the homes of election workers. We've seen that again this past week or so in North Carolina. The violent attack on the husband of Nancy Pelosi. The attacks on FEMA workers just a few weeks ago in North Carolina. And just this week, a Public Affairs Council poll that showed only 37% of us, 30% of Americans, believe that the 2024 elections will be both, quote, honest and open to rightful voters, while 43% have serious doubts about their honesty, openness, or both. And I think this is very concerning, because it means that no matter who actually wins, a significant portion of the American people won't believe that they won. And that has huge ramifications for their credibility and whether or not people think that they are, in fact, living under a rightful government. Now, people expect disinformation from social media. I think we all know that. But here's a statistic that I think is really worth sitting with. They also expect disinformation from mainstream media. So 42% of us expect disinformation on social media, but nearly as many of us expect disinformation from the mainstream media. Political candidates, PACs, and then here's a really scary statistic. So I don't have a good number, and I don't think anyone does, about how much disinformation on the internet comes from foreign governments, but we know there's a lot of evidence that quite a bit of it does, possibly even the lion's share. I mean, this is an area of active research, but only 11% of us are worried about foreign governments putting disinformation on the internet, and only 6% of us are worried about major companies, even though we know that at least some major companies have put huge amounts of disinformation onto that social media. So we distrust the social media, but we don't understand where a lot of the false information is coming from. So what do we do about this? Well, Professor McIntyre and I are about to talk about that in some more detail, but I just want to say a few things about this that are really relevant to conversations that I had with students today. There are many, many different polls that show that for the vast majority of people, the most trusted source of information are friends and family. And that means that if we want people to be thinking about these problems, we should be talking to our friends and family about them. And yet many of us don't. We don't because we're afraid of conflict. One of the students said to me just at dinner, I don't want to have a fight with my grandfather. And that's very understandable. None of us really want to have a fight with the people we love. We don't want to have a fight with our neighbors. But if we don't talk to our friends and family, then we miss the opportunity to give them the benefits of things we may have learned here at university or in our reading, or even just to share ideas with them. So what I want to say to all the young people, particularly in the audience, but actually to everyone, is that we need to talk about these issues. And the more difficult they are, probably the more we need to talk, and we have to stop avoiding them just because they're difficult. We need to talk to our friends and families about what we know, what we've learned, what we've researched. We need to open up the conversation, and that's what we're going to try to do now. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
Nice job. Well, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
This is the book, the most recent book, The Big Myth. It's a big book, but it's very well written. It's really terrifically researched, and the students had a chance to read some of it. And we're just going to spend a few minutes to go over some of the things that maybe you didn't get to earlier. At the end of the first chapter, you write the following. The blood-stained story of economic individualism and unrestrained capitalist competition does not, I should have thought, today needs stressing. And that was Isaiah Berlin in 1969. Now, he was probably wrong then, but that story has certainly been forgotten today. What happened?
Well, what happened is really what we try to explain in the book. So in the book, we tell the story of how a certain sector of corporate America actively worked to try to efface the truth about American history, and particularly to efface all of the damage and all the problems that had developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, in order instead to argue that you could trust the free market, you could trust the business community to run the economy well, that you could trust the magic of the marketplace, and that you didn't need government regulation of the market. And of course, the experience of the early 20th century had proven that you did, that when markets were unregulated, factory owners would hire children as young as 2 years old to work in textile mills, for example. When factories were unregulated, huge numbers of workers were injured or killed on the job. And government regulations, laws, statutes had worked to really decrease those problems. They didn't eliminate them 100%, but they had decreased them substantially. But the business community fought back to rewrite history and to claim that those laws weren't needed, and in fact, more than that, that those laws threatened personal freedom, and that when the government became involved in the economy, whether it was to protect against child labor or to address pollution, that it threatened our freedom as individuals. And therefore, the American people needed to resist big government, resist government intervention. We don't really like the word intervention because, the intervention implies that the government's here and the market's there, and that the government is somehow interfering as opposed to government being a natural part and parcel of the economy. So to push these ideas so that we would not support government control or government statutes that would address things like worker safety, environmental protection, and now climate change.
One of the things I think you really do well is go back to those early debates about child labor, the New Deal, the privatization of electricity in the early days. And we're sitting here tonight, and it's the 95th anniversary of the stock market crash in 1929.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about a market failure. So how was it that after the collapse of the economy during the Great Depression, the winning of the World War by government, by the way, that the propaganda campaign after World War II by corporations through people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek, how was that so successful?
Well, I think one of the reasons the book is so long is because we're making the argument is it took a lot of work. People are not idiots. People don't succumb to falsehoods that readily. But if you tell people an untrue thing and you tell it repeatedly and you tell it in many different ways and you get many different people to say it and you hire academics to give it gravitas, over time you can begin to persuade people to believe something that is untrue. And that's really the argument of the book. We're not saying that one big bad corporation waved a magic wand or put something in our water to make us all idiots. No, that's not the argument. The argument is that it's exactly what you just said. The stock market crash, the Great Depression, plus the accident crisis had really proven to the American people that the free market wasn't free at all, that there were really big costs. And so the American people had, by and large, supported the New Deal, elected FDR 4 times, and even many sectors of the business community, the US Chamber of Commerce, they didn't really like the New Deal, but they had accepted that at least some parts of it were reasonable compromise. But there was a certain sector of the business community, led by the National Association of Manufacturers, a trade group representing factory owners, that really was really offended that some of their business colleagues had compromised with FDR on these issues. And so they began this campaign really to rewrite history. And they realized it would take a while, and they were patient, and they were diligent. So there are lessons here for, you can learn lessons even from people you disagree with. And so they began to do a number of different things. They ran massive propaganda campaigns, spent hundreds of millions of dollars in like 1945 dollars. They paid academics to rewrite textbooks to be more oriented to the free market. They made donations to universities and business schools to develop curricula that would promote the virtues of the free market and stress the threat to freedom of government intervention. They worked with filmmakers in Hollywood to change the kinds of films. During the Great Depression and in the 1920s, there were lots of films that showed bankers as evil and rich people as idiots. Not saying that that was necessarily right either, but there are documents that we found that we talk about in the book where the Motion Picture Association says, no, we're not going to make movies like that. And my favorite quotation that's in the book, the head of the Motion Picture Association says, there'll be no more Grapes of Wrath. I mean, The Grapes of Wrath was a brilliant, beautiful movie that won a lot of awards based on a brilliant, important book, one of the most important books in American literature at that time. But it depicted the real struggles that ordinary working Americans had experienced during the Great Depression. And Hollywood says, we won't make movies like that. And so in the 1950s, we see Hollywood, with the support of NEM and other groups, also Ronald Reagan, working consciously to make films, and then later television, promoting the virtues of the free market, of American individualism, etc. And there's more. I mean, as you said, it's a big book because there's so much to it. And it was really, in a way, that's the big discovery of the book, was to see in how many different domains these people worked to promote this story, including academic life, and how it works because they're patient, they're diligent, they spend a lot of money, and then finally they help get Ronald Reagan elected president.
Right, and that's when it becomes mainstream.
Right.
Dishonesty, denial of evidence, runs like a thread through the whole book. And you talk about epistemic arrogance, which I like that term. Maybe you could tell us what you mean by that.
So one of the things that Eric Conway and I have been really grappling with for a long time now is to try to understand how is it that intelligent, educated people promote ideas that to us as historians would seem to be patently, at best, incomplete, and in some cases, dishonest. And this came up for us, especially when we wrote our first book, but it comes up again here, because many of the names, many of the people who are in the story are famous people, people like the economist Milton Friedman or George Stigler, both of whom won Nobel Memorial Prizes, Robert Bork, the jurist, who had a very profound influence, and in our previous works, Frederick Seitz, who was a president of the US National Academy of Sciences, president of the Rockefeller University. So these are not stupid people by any stretch of the imagination. They're highly successful people, and they're highly educated. So how do you make sense of that? And one of the things we notice when we're reading their letters or their correspondence is this incredible arrogance, this kind of overweening arrogance that they know better. that ordinary people are dumb. I mean, they actually have an incredible condescension towards people who don't agree with them, tremendous condescension towards working class people and people of color, but also this sense that they know, that they somehow know better. And it's a kind of social Darwinian perspective, and in the book we talk a bit about some explicitly social Darwinian arguments that some of these people make, that the reason they're so successful is because they are superior people. And then they surround themselves, so that's just straight out arrogance, right? But then there's this additional component that they begin to believe that their beliefs are superior as well. And this is the piece we call epistemic arrogance. And then they surround themselves with other people who feel the same way. I mean, one of the things we show in the book is how a group of business executives helped to build the Chicago School of Economics to focus on a particular interpretation of neoliberalism. So the Chicago School before 1944 was still probably more conservative or more right-wing, however you want to describe it, than many other economics departments in this country. But there was a fairly wide range of views among the people who were in the early Chicago School. But after the war, we see that range narrowing in part because these business leaders fund particular projects and encourage the hiring of particular people who will reinforce these views. And so then it becomes a kind of epistemically closed community where they're not actually, in many cases, exposing their views to the kinds of challenges that they might be exposed to if they were part of a broader community. And so the other part of the argument is that by doing this, they avoid what the philosopher Jose Medina calls epistemic friction. That in a good university where we do have an open exchange of ideas, we do encounter ideas we may not agree with, and that's a good thing because it forces us to rethink our own ideas. And that friction is healthy. It's the kind of friction that generates energy. And these people manage to build worlds in which, by and large, they don't experience epistemic friction.
I have one more, and then I think we're going to go to the audience. Throughout the book, you make a point of claiming that the problem is not capitalism, it's the way we think about capitalism. But isn't the problem capitalism?
Yeah, well, that's a fair question. And I have to say, as we were finishing the book, Eric Conway and I had that conversation over more than one beer. And I want to say I don't know. But I guess the reason we came to that conclusion for a couple of reasons. One thing was sort of a broader historical point that when we talk about capitalism, we throw that word around a lot, and especially in recent years, we've seen lots of people throwing the word around. But capitalism isn't just one thing. There have been many forms of capitalism through the course of history, and all US historians know this. I'm not saying anything that isn't obvious to any US historian who might be sitting here tonight. And the capitalism that Adam Smith was imagining, that was beginning to develop when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, was radically different than the capitalism that developed in the 19th century, which is radically different from the capitalism that we have today. And so just like any historian would know that if we were to make a claim about religion, we would know, well, that's a bit silly. There are many different kinds of religions, and they've had very different impacts in the world. Or the state, right? We know there are many different kinds of governance, and yet somehow we talk about capitalism as if it's just one thing, and that it hasn't evolved, and it's not nuanced. So we were hoping, in a way, to open up a conversation about different forms of capitalism and the possibility for yet a new form of capitalism in the future that would be, I don't know, more responsible. And we thought about having a final chapter where we would actually talk about that, and then we thought, no, this book is already too long, and that, in a way, it's a whole different book. But we played with, could we have something like full accounting capitalism, like a capitalism that took full account of the external costs? So that's what we were trying to get at. And not to say that in the future there won't be something new entirely. I mean, obviously, there will be. People who lived under feudalism didn't necessarily imagine capitalism. So, we're not saying that there couldn't be some other economic system in the future, but at least for now, we could have a conversation about different kinds of capitalism. And then the other thing also, in some ways, and we say this in the introduction, in some ways our book is a response to Naomi Klein, because sometimes I get mixed up with her. And one time at a party, someone came up to me gushing, saying, "Are you Naomi Klein?" I was like, "No," and they were clearly disappointed. So, oh well, okay. She's younger and prettier. But,
well, she's nice too, but so are you.
Well, thank you, right. But here's the thing, when I first read her book, This Changes Everything, and she says, you know, we have to change everything. I remember being troubled because I think if you tell people that you have to change everything, that feels like a hopeless task. But if you say, well, hold on a second, we don't have to change everything, but there are some key things that if we changed would make a difference, that feels to me like a more plausible argument, and I think that's what we were trying to get at.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to go to questions from the audience now, and I'm going to ask that when you ask your question, you stand up and you ask a question rather than making a speech. And we have Brian and we have Beth with microphones.
So government is often seen as inefficient and cumbersome due to, I believe it's layers of bureaucracy. Can you tell me in what things is the government, are like public industries actually better? And why do you think that this government has a reputation of being inefficient, whereas private companies don't?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So I think one of the reasons we think government is inefficient is because that's what we've been repeatedly told. And that's part of the story we tell in the book, how government inefficiency is part of this story that gets told about the magic of the marketplace and the power of the free market. So that's part of the propaganda story. And so against them, real life examples of government programs that work well, Social Security, right? Before the Great Depression, many, many elderly people lived in extreme poverty. Social Security fixed that. And although it may not be a perfect system, it has worked well. It has achieved its goal of eliminating elderly poverty. And it's one of the most popular programs in the United States. Public opinion polls consistently show that anywhere from 85 to 90% of Americans approve of Social Security. They like it. They worry that it may not still be available in the future, but that's because of all the political attacks on it. So Social Security is a really good example of a successful program. The internet is another example. A lot of us have the image that the internet was created by a bunch of guys in hoodies in Menlo Park, but that's not true. The internet was built by the federal government supporting science and engineering through universities like the University of Rhode Island. But after it was built, the government made the decision, and I think I would say the sensible decision, to declassify it, because it was built originally as a classified system for military communications, to declassify it and to encourage the private sector to commercialize it or to see how they could use it for commercial products. And here's a little known fact. The right wing loves to demonize Al Gore and claim that he said he invented the internet. He never did say that. But what he did do is that he was the principal sponsor of the bill that declassified the internet, because he recognized that this was a tool that in the hands of the private sector could do great things. But that was built by the government and built rather efficiently, I would say. And there are many more examples. The space program is another one. Again, Elon Musk is giving away money to people, trying to, I shouldn't say bribe, but I guess I can say bribe. This isn't a court of law. Trying to bribe people to vote for Donald Trump, which seems to be patently illegal, but I'm not the Department of Justice. But he could never have done any of the things he did with SpaceX had the US government not created the foundation for the space program. The US space program has been wildly successful. The only reason we can even have these phones with GPS on them is because of satellites in space. And it was the US government and the Soviets who developed that technology, not the private sector. So there are many examples like this where governments, either here in the United States or elsewhere, and the Soviet space program was wildly successful too, and that was done under communism. So it proves governments can do successful programs in both capitalist and communist countries. But both of those governments were smart enough to recognize that at a certain point, it may make sense to hand things over to the private sector and because the other important part of this story, and Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, is really good on this. The private sector likes us to think that they love risk, that they take big risks, and that's why they deserve to make so much money, because they take these big risks. But what Mazzucato shows is that actually it's not true. That if you look at these things that were truly risky, like the space program, in the early days, the private sector wanted nothing to do with it because it was too risky. But governments can take risks that the private sector can't or won't, because government doesn't have to report to shareholders and doesn't have to worry about quarterly dividends. And government can take the long view in a way that the private sector rarely does. And so again, she shows many of these innovative technologies were actually developed by government, not the private sector.
Other questions?
Yeah, I don't think, is it turned on? Well, maybe you can just speak up loudly.
Maybe repeat the
Yeah,
question.
that's a good question. What are my thoughts on misinformation that isn't necessary for a particular purpose other than just creating chaos or because someone kind of gets a perverse pleasure out of, throwing a spanner in the works? I think that's really important, and I think that's an area that really needs more study because we know that quite a bit of the, I'll call it disinformation, but maybe it's misinformation, but quite a lot of what is on the internet now from foreign governments like Russia and China is deliberately intended to destabilize American society, to increase polarization, because the Russians want, Vladimir Putin wants American society to be destabilized. It serves his interest. So some of this is intended to cause chaos, but it doesn't mean it isn't deliberate. Now, I think you are getting at also another phenomenon, which would just be, I don't know, some person who, for whatever reason, gets a perverse pleasure out of just putting ridiculous junk on social media. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know what you do about that. That would be a really good research question to better understand, what those people are getting out of doing that and what, if anything, you could do to rectify it.
Relevant. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
One part that I thought was most interesting, I'm in pharmacy health studies, and your discussion on masks misinformation when it came to the pandemic, I thought was very interesting because that was a belief that was very politically driven to having freedom and whatnot, but had huge ramifications. It wasn't a belief that was like widespread prior to the need of masks for COVID. And as someone who's going to go into an industry where I'm communicating with a lot of patients, either like close one-on-one community style or large information of any style, I'm kind of curious, how do you navigate debates and arguments with people whose beliefs in something are more personally politically founded and not directly backed so much by facts, like in this case, oh, masks don't work. Maybe it's caused by someone told them masks don't work and it's that misinformation, but they don't always have like that immediate ramifications of, well, if you don't wear a mask, you get COVID and whatnot.
Yeah, well, that's a really tough question. I'm not a psychologist, and I think, maybe there's research in the psychology literature that could help with this. But I think, my impression is that a lot of the political disinformation around masking, as you said and I said in my talk, was organized around the notion of personal freedom, that this should be my decision to make. And this is continuing now. We see on the internet people who are arguing against vaccination, ongoing vaccination or other vaccines on the grounds of, quote, medical freedom. And of course, this is very noxious because vaccines have been around for a long time. In a way, these people are trying to rewrite history, right? Because schools have had vaccine requirements for kindergarten for half a century, and until pretty recently, not too many people worried about that. But it's being used as part of this sort of generalized argument about opposing oppressive government, opposing, quote, big government, that I should have the freedom to decide for myself. But in this case, that freedom puts other people's lives at risk. And so I do think it's tricky, and I think it's probably the sort of thing that you may have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. But I can imagine that many people, if you said to them, if they're in a hospital situation, and you said something like, I understand wearing a mask is a pain in the neck, and I understand that you don't want to do it, and frankly, neither do I, But there are people in this hospital who, if they catch, if they get COVID or they get measles, they will die. And, so we're doing this because we care about the patients in this hospital. And so to try to appeal to people, to get away from the overarching political argument and appeal to people's basic sense of decency, empathy, fellow feeling. Most of us do care about other people, even if our politics doesn't always reflect that. And I think if you can make it real for people by talking about, who's at risk here? There's Joe down the hall is immunocompromised. Well, maybe in a hospital you can't reveal medical information, but you could say, we have patients in this hospital who are immunocompromised, and even a simple cold could kill them. I do think that that kind of honest, serious but honest conversation can make a difference. But it takes time, and of course in a hospital setting you may be busy, it may be hard, but I do think it's important for all of us when we're in a situation where we could have a conversation like that to take the time to have that conversation.
We're going to have one more question.
At the end, you talked about this responsible type of capitalism that could potentially emerge following some massive overhaul of our current system. But something that is sort of, I guess, contrary to that seems that how can you view a business other than a rational agent that just wants to have more money? You consume more because a business, I don't know, wants to benefit its shareholders the most. So if doing disinformation will benefit them the most, then they do that. They will choose unethical strategies if it will ultimately get them more money in the end. How can you sort of view a system where businesses will be responsible if ultimately the end goal is to make the most amount of money for their shareholders?
Well, I think this is where history is really helpful and kind of empowering because it wasn't always like that. So the whole notion that the only responsibility of corporations was to return shareholder value was promoted by Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics. And we know that he was hired in part by a group of business people who wanted him to promote that view. Before the 1970s, that was not the standard view in American business. And lots of corporations some corporations still do. Lots of corporations still give money to the ballet, the opera, museums. Corporate sponsorship of other stuff is all over the place. And Friedman opposed that. He said that that was wrong, that the corporate executives were misusing shareholder money when they gave money to the ballet or to a museum, that it should all be returned to individuals, and individuals should decide for themselves what they wanted to do. Now, you can argue with whether that's right or wrong, but the point is, before the 1970s, that's not how most corporations thought about it. Now, once the Chicago schools successfully put that idea into play, it was very, very damaging because then some companies, not all, and it's an interesting question why some companies went one way and others went other ways, but some companies actually faced lawsuits from shareholders if they spent money in other ways. And the Securities and Exchange Commission actually began to buy this argument. And there were cases where corporations lost lawsuits over these issues, and so that then made other companies incredibly gun-shy about doing anything else but what Milton Friedman had recommended. But that was an interpretation of the law, and so in part because of that, new laws were introduced in some places to create what are known as B corporations, the so-called benefit corporation. So if you would like to run a corporation and have that corporation run in part for the good of society and not be restricted to only maximizing shareholder value, one way you can do that in this country is to incorporate as a B corporation. And there are companies that have done this, not a lot, it's not the dominant thing, but it's, to me, two things about this. Super sad that laws had to be passed to make it legal for a corporation to do the right thing. That's a little scary, but it proves the point that you could, at least in principle, have laws like that in all 50 states. You could begin a movement. You could begin a movement in business schools to push forward the idea that every state should have a law to make B corporations, to protect B corporations. And then that could become a movement to open this question, well, why did we ever think that the only reason a corporation should ever exist is to maximize shareholder value? Because it's not what people thought in the past. And in fact, I mean, I don't know if there's business historians here, and if there are, again, they know more than I do. But if you go back far enough, being a corporation was considered a privilege. I mean, if you think about, like, you know, in Britain they have what they call them chartered corporations. The idea of getting a charter to create a corporation was considered a privilege, and companies had to make the case for why it was in the public interest that they should be allowed to incorporate. So we don't have to accept the Milton Friedman argument that that's the only way businesses can operate. And I think that's part of the sort of reform that I was talking about when I was saying we can imagine capitalism has operated differently in the past, and we can imagine that it could operate differently again in the future.
Thank you, Naomi. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Here's the book, available at bookstores nationwide.
And you don't have to order from Amazon. You can get it at bookshop.org, who will then put in the order with whatever your local nearest independent bookstore is.
Very good.
So.
Thank you very much. I hope you will join us back here once again in 2 weeks. A special thank you to Dr. Naomi Oreskes and to Dr. McIntyre for that enlightening talk and conversation. And best of luck avoiding the news for the next week or so. Good evening.